Abe, do you remember who went first last time? Because for the life of me, I can't remember. Oh, hey everyone. I'm Dustin Bass with the Sons of History. Now, every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Central Time, I do a show on Instagram Live. Now, I'd love it if you'd join me on Instagram on Thursday nights, but until then, you can watch all of the previously recorded episodes here on YouTube. So, while you're enjoying this conversation, I'm going to be enjoying a little game of chess with my good friend Thomas Jefferson. And don't worry, Abraham Lincoln is here just to keep us honest. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the show. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Thursday Night Live Chats. Got a very special guest. He's been a guest on the podcast before, so you can always go check out his stuff that we've talked to him about. I think we talked to him a couple of months ago, I want to say at the beginning of the year. Really engaging conversation. It's going to be John McCaskill. So, this is going to be a very engaging conversation. I think you saw in the background of the image that we put up, statues being toppled, and that is more or less what we're going to be talking about. So I am going to get him in on here and go live with him in just one quick second. Let me send him a bit of an invite. And so there is John. Let's get him in here. Let's go with it. Here we are. So, connecting. Hey,
What's going on, man?
hey, man.
Hey, how's it going? Hey, it's good to see you too, man. It's good to be seen, and it's good to see you too.
There you go, man. It's good to actually now see your face, like actually seeing your face, because we've always just done the audio on the podcast. I was talking about that a second ago, how we've had you on the podcast before. Really engaging conversation. I had someone who's a big fan of the show. She's like, "Oh, is this the same person that y'all had on the podcast a few months back?" And I was like, "Same one." And she's like, "Okay, this is going to be a great conversation." So I'm looking forward to great things, man.
Listen, I hope she still likes me when this thing is over with.
Hey, hey, man. Look, here's the thing. I know this is going to be a touchy conversation, and I'm fine. I'm all good with it. You know, I think that I need your point of view. I think we all need everybody's thought out point of view. And I know that you are a man who thinks things through. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
This is going to be a very enlightening conversation. Okay, but before we get into the nitty gritty of everything, John W. McCaskill, you do something called History Live. John W. McCaskill, JWM History Alive. Enlighten us. What is it that you do with that?
So John W. McCaskill, History Alive, teaches the principles of leadership and teamwork using history as the vehicle through which to do that. There are a variety of arenas I can do that. In addition to that, so people may ask me to come lecture. They may ask me to do something, Zoom wise or something, but I also have the opportunity to dress up in different periods. And I think my earliest period is the Revolutionary War period. And my latest period is the Civil Rights era, 1960s. And there are quite a few impressions in between, including American Civil War, World War I, and my favorite, obviously, World War II.
Okay. So you dress up in character. Are there particular characters that you dress up as? Okay, just a quick little issue right there. We're going to have John right back in here. He is, and hopefully we have a better connection here.
So how about that, man? I think, you know what? The route I switched to is right up under me now, so this should be a bit better.
Okay, so right now you're good. Yeah, you seem to be streaming very, very well. Okay,
sweet.
So last question I asked was, are there particular historical figures that you dress up as across these eras?
Normally I don't. If I do first person, when I do World War II, I'll do a composite character. I'm doing myself, but it's a composite character. I do a Tuskegee Airman impression, and so I will it will be me over there,
Yep.
but I may talk about some of the stories of the guys who were really over there.
Mm-hmm.
And if I do something in the 60s, it may be a composite character who is recalling maybe something that happened that he was an eyewitness to. But I don't really do first person because it would call for a whole lot, particularly listening to the person if there's some sort of audio recordings of the person. And I just don't think that I would be able to do a person justice by trying to be them.
Yeah.
But certainly saying that I was one of the people there, I think that that's just as effective.
So it sounds like it sort of keeps you from having to monologue. Is that correct?
Sometimes I will monologue if
Okay.
if I'm referring to someone else, and then I said, "Here's what such and such says." Then I may go into the character as if I am that person, but I'm not going to stay in it.
Okay.
After the monologue, when I used to do talks on Dr. King, I would I would do some of his speeches and some of his sermons.
Okay.
I never tried to be him, but tried to be close in recollecting what he actually said at the time.
Okay. All right. Now your website. Tell people about your website so they can go check that out once we're all said and done.
So I've got a website, John W. McCaskill History Alive. That's jwmhistoryalive.com. I'm on Facebook. I have a John W. McCaskill History Alive page on Facebook. I've got one on Instagram. And well, maybe it's just John W. McCaskill on Instagram. And I also have a YouTube channel, which I've been doing some films
Okay.
on various topics. And I think my last one was a tribute to Representative John Lewis and Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian. And it's really not just telling their story, but my recollections with them, because I had time with the both of them, and I talk about that. And there are other topics that I talk about, including a woman by the name of Miss Amelia R. Jones, who was a World War II veteran who was here in 2014 at the World War II Memorial with a group called Honor Flight. And she had no idea she was a Tuskegee Airman. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And we put the pieces together, and she ended up getting her red jacket and ultimately got her Congressional Gold Medal as World War II, as a Tuskegee Airman. And most people had no idea that women could qualify for that. Well, that film is on there too. So there's so many films that I'm doing, and really just trying to, as I said, tell the story of lesser told stories.
Yeah. No, I remember us talking about that situation. That was so, I guess, heartening. It was just good to hear that you were in the right place at the right time with the knowledge that you had that, hey, you are actually a Tuskegee Airman. So that was a beautiful story. I remember going through that. Okay. All right, John, let's get right into the conversation. Over the past couple of months, there has been a lot of chaos, to put it mildly, and some of that has spilled over into monuments and statues being defaced, torn down. First question, though, the importance of monuments for posterity's sake.
Well, sure. Monuments are absolutely important. I had actually gone back. If you look, for those who read the Old Testament, in Judges, there is instruction on monuments. You put monuments up so that people will remember. At one point, Joshua is instructed. He says, look, at some point, the children are going to ask about these stories and what happened. Well, you need to be able to tell them, and you need to have monuments there that will bring a remembrance back to that. So that's absolutely important. It is possible for one generation removed to forget from whence they've come, and that becomes a very dangerous and a very expensive price to pay if you don't know from whence you come. So monuments are absolutely important.
Now, I trust that you're talking about the crossing over Jordan, the stones. Is that what we're referencing?
Yes. Judges, what did I write down? Judges 4, 24, 21 and 24.
Mm-hmm.
And also Judges 2 and 10. When it talks about a generation, the previous generation forgot what happened to them from whence they came.
And
so, right.
That's what's interesting. That's one of the things that we learn from the New Testament. You know, Alan and I, we reference about, we have a scripture at the end of all of our podcast episodes, but we reference the Bible quite often. And one of the things that the children of Israel also did was they sang a song that talked about getting out of Egypt, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
And so there was this constant reminder that we must remember the past in order to appreciate where we are right now.
Yes.
And so I think it was either the Frederick Douglass talk that we talked about at the Martin Luther King. I can't remember, but I think we used the scripture in Proverbs that do not remove the landmark of your fathers. And that is one of the things, is like right now we're seeing the sort of the opposite, right? And we're going to get into the conversation of, should we have certain monuments and statues, and you know, there are certain ones, and even ones that have been pulled down, that shouldn't be. They should be honored. One of them in particular would be Frederick Douglass. There was a Frederick Douglass statue that was torn down. The 54th Regiment was defaced not too long ago. So these are things that we have to continue to remember. So you still are you able to hear me, John?
Oh, I can hear you.
Okay, I was just making sure, because you were like messing with the ears. I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, something else is happening. I think it's my ceiling fan, but it's cool. I turned it off.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, you're fine, because I can't hear that, so you're good.
Okay.
You're out in DC, correct?
I am.
All right. What is the DC landscape? What does it look like right now? And I'll get to my second question on top of that. What does it look like right now?
So if you come to Washington, D.C. right now, and, you know, we have, I think tourism is like the first, if not second, you know, highest revenue generating endeavor that we have here. Most people come here to see the memorials and the monuments. And if you go down on the National Mall, you can see all of them. And it's one thing to see them on television or in books. It is a completely different thing to see them in person. And it's not just one, but there's so many. I mean, the Lincoln Memorial has been the backdrop for so many different things. The World War II Memorial, just some of the stories I have encountered with World War II veterans because of that memorial. And so just you know, and it's funny because I'll be driving downtown and I'll go past these memorials and I never get to the point where I'm like, oh, it's just such and such. Every time I see it, I'm like, wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And we've got statues all over the city. And so that's, if somebody was to define Washington, D.C. with one word, it would probably be memorials.
Right.
Well, hopefully it would be memorials.
Yeah.
Because somebody else may have some other ways of describing it right now, but that's a different topic, right?
Politics may have something to do with it, but yeah, God bless us. About how many, or do you know about how many monuments are there in Washington, D.C., roughly?
Oh my goodness. You know, I'd say about 12 years ago, I used to know that number, and the list I pulled up came up by quadrants.
Yeah. Which
ones are in Northwest, which ones are Northeast, which ones Southwest, Southeast. I do know that on the National Mall, probably around 8 major ones, because now Eisenhower is about to open, and there's one for wounded veterans, which is open. So there are quite a few. But if you talk about all of the statues, I have no idea what that number is. That number, it's a finite number. We can figure it out, but they're all over the place.
Right. Okay. So let's say that somebody's coming maybe from another country, or just somebody here in the States who's never been to Washington, D.C. What are some of the, and they've got just a couple of days, what are some of the monuments that they must go to?
Oh my goodness. You know, when I used to work down on the mall and people would ask me, what's your favorite memorial? I told them it depends on the day that you catch me. Because if I'm feeling World War II, then I'm going to say, oh man, you need to see that World War II. And all of these memorials have symbolism that if you don't know, you may show up and say, oh, it's a nice memorial, and go on about your business.
Yeah.
But if you have someone there to interpret, to tell you what everything means, it's so much better. I would probably, oh geez, I can't give you one, but I would definitely say
Right.
World War II, and I definitely say Dr. King. Those are the two memorials I would say you've got to go see.
Okay. All right. And then obviously, I mean, you gave, the Lincoln Memorial that plays the backdrop for so many things. It's massive and beautiful and powerful
And symbolic.
and symbolic. So, all right. So, getting to sort of the nitty gritty of it. So, statues are being pulled down by mobs compared to being removed via city council or left up or some other alternative. What should be done regarding with that? And instead of, if you could be in front of, I don't want to say a mob, because we all know thousands of years, those who came before us said you're not going to be able to get through to a mob. But if you could talk to somebody who's like, I think they should just be pulled down, by the people in the middle of the night, what would you say if you wanted to remove a statue or something? How should it be done?
I think people need to come together and be real about what these monuments and memorials mean to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if people are honest, they're going to hear some people who say, hey, this thing is hurtful to me, and here's why. And they say, oh, okay, never knew that. Let's take them down.
Yeah.
Or at least let's remove them,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think you asked a question about how should they be statues being pulled down by mobs compared to being removed. Listen, under no circumstances should there be the destruction of property. When that happens, it takes away your credibility of what you're trying to do when you begin to stoop to levels that are not proper. I'll say it that way, right? So I think that there is a process through which these statues and memorials should be addressed. At the same time, I understand people's frustration, because what you see are people who are at the point where they don't think that the American dream is attainable to them. And Dr. King said that rioting was the voice of the unheard. And before we start to judge why a person's protesting, we really need to find out the why behind it. Case in point, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he told everybody why he took a knee. He said it was because of police brutality. But then people got a hold of it and tried to turn his story into something else, that he hated the flag, he hated the military, and that's not what he said. And so what that says to us is maybe somebody's not listening. He was talking about police brutality back in 2014 or whenever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what we're dealing with now? We're still dealing with that issue.
Right.
So I don't think that people should go and just pull stuff down and just tear stuff down. I will never say that needs to happen. But I do understand the why behind sometimes people do what they do. How much time do we have, man?
We've still got 40 minutes, so we're good.
Okay, so let me just quickly tell you this story. When I was in graduate school, I think it was my African American history class. We were talking about Nat Turner, not so much what he did, but how it was taught years later. And I thought about it when I was in school. Nat Turner, he was a hero. He was a person who was trying to fight against slavery, and he did what he did, right? There was a woman who was interviewed in this film that we had to watch, and she says, well, he didn't have to go through and kill the women and the children and I thought to myself, in that particular instance, had it not been something drastic, would people have listened? Colin Kaepernick could have took a knee in his backyard, but nobody would have heard about it, and we would have just gone on. It'd been the status quo as usual. So So the answer to your question is no. I don't think people should be pulling stuff down, tearing up stuff. But I think that there is a process that we need to go through, and people need to believe that if they go through that process is going to be just for them as it is other people. And I don't need to tell you, we've got a lot of examples right now where justice has not necessarily been equal. I mean, it's been egregiously unequal. And so when you tell a kid, listen, I'm dealing with kids all the time, white kids, black kids, all kids. And you tell them work hard, go to school, get good grades, and everything's going to work out all right. Now they're starting to question that. Really? Is that, because some people didn't even have to do that and it looks like they're doing fine. And then people who do that are still having to, so there have been times it's been hard for me to, after something that's happened in our society has happened, and then I'm like, okay, I've got kids to deal with on this Sunday. What am I going to say to them? Because really, I didn't have the words to say anything to. I had to, what do you say to that?
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the dialogue. That's a part of what needs to be talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. It's like it's the twisting of what the actual intent is, and I think that is happening at every angle. Take for instance, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, and him taking the knee, right? And there were a lot of people who were like, this guy is in the NFL, millionaire, does all this stuff, and he's taking a knee, disrespecting the flag. And so people came in with that argument, and to an extent made it into something bigger than it was, when it was something that was just like, here's a simple statement that is not simple, because he obviously knew that a lot of people were going to get very upset about that action, right? And so there are certain things, just like stepping into that arena is not going to be like, well, if I can just get my point across, then everybody is going to understand where I'm coming from. And it's not that easy. It's just like on the same side as the police brutality, right? Well, these moments in time where police brutality has been egregious, and that's putting it mildly. And then you have people who come in and say, all cops are like this. It's just like, now you've totally screwed up the entire conversation to where you can't have a conversation, because now you're on extremes, right? There is no meeting in the middle. And I think we've gotten to a place where it's very difficult to get there, to where you're getting into the middle, to where you're doing something like this, where you're having the conversation and saying, we gotta meet somewhere.
And people don't want to meet. And James 4 is clear on that. The reason why you are warring amongst yourselves is because you want what you can't have. Nobody wants to compromise.
Yeah.
It's my way or the highway. And anytime people approach the table like that, I just tell you right now, nothing's gonna result from that.
No, not at all. So I wish we could just say, eventually people will. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't know how it gets to the point where you say, okay, we've made adjustments. I mean, you make adjustments through legislation, you make corrections, but to just across the board make just a broad statement and saying this is how it is, it's like that's not how it is. You can't just with a broad brush just swoop across and say. But there are certain things that are in the laws that, whether or not you believe that they were done for the right reasons, if you make a law, and for an example, the qualified immunity law, right? Well, that's something that may have been put in the 60s for a noble reason, but now you give all of these cases, and you see that it's no longer really qualified immunity. It looks a lot like absolute immunity, right? And so these are things that a lot of people who, I think a lot of people who are out there, screaming and shouting and everything and saying these broad statements don't really know the intricacies of what exactly are some of the problems.
Oh, absolutely.
And they don't want, and I get onto some of my friends too. I'm like, you don't want to take the time to study and research and find out what the issues are. You just want to scream, shout, and copy and paste somebody's post and put it on your Instagram feed.
Yep.
So,
Well, listen, but you know, part of that is education. And I'm not quite sure how serious we are about education in this country, because if you really educate people, it's going to teach people how to be able to process and think for themselves.
yeah,
And you've got a certain percentage of folks who don't want people to do that. They just want to be able to be told, hey, this is what you do, and hope that people do it.
right.
And this broad brushing issue that you just brought up, listen, that has been the history of black folk since the very beginning. I mean, 1915, D.W. Griffith puts out the movie Birth of a Nation. That thing is on YouTube. It's about 3 hours long, but there's so many stereotypes in there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I could go through a whole lot of them, but here's a broad brush. And then it's almost like this is how black folk are. And if you look at how blacks were portrayed in movies, there was a guy by the name of Willie Best, and there was another one, can't think of his name, but there's two of them. And I looked at the roles that they did, and their roles were so demeaning. I'm almost like, why would you even play those roles because of what it portrays? And I get it. You know, they had families to feed.
Yeah.
But what it shows us is through the lens through which people saw black folk. 1925, there was the Army's report on the use of Negro manpower during wartime. And they took a small group of individuals from the 92nd Infantry Division, which was all black, and the 92nd fought under the U.S. flag, while the 93rd fought under the French flag. 93rd got all sorts of awards, but the 92nd did not. And so they took a few people from there, and the conclusions they came up with: blacks are leaderless, they're lazy, they got small brains, they're afraid of the dark, they'll turn tail and fight. You can't trust them for any sort of higher cognitive processes like flying airplanes, which 992 brothers, you know, blew that out the water.
Yeah.
But that's the broad brush that we already have. And I'm going to tell you, as a black man, you go to work and, you know, it's one thing you got to think about your job, but then you also got to think about, am I not offending somebody? I don't want to come across as a violent black man. I mean, it's all sorts of stuff. Yeah. And it's almost like you are welcome to come into the group as long as you abide by these rules. And so there are certain things that I'm not going to be able to talk about. And what I found amazing was right after the Civil War, a lot of these former enslaved individuals wrote their memoirs. And what a lot of former people who claimed ownership over people say, really, what? I didn't know they didn't like slavery. Wait, I thought they liked it. No, you never asked the question. And when people did ask the question, it ended up getting them in trouble. There's an instance in Mr. Douglas's first autobiography. He talks about there was a person who was enslaved who was talking to the guy who owned it, didn't know who he was because the guy had so many people. And he asked him, how's everything going? And he told him, it's rough. I don't like it. He says, oh, I hope it gets better for you. A couple of days later, he sold down into the deep South where it only got worse. So, you know, it's like you don't want to talk about it because somebody may ask how you doing, but they don't really want to know how you're doing.
Yeah. You know, speaking of the broad brush, we got a question by A. Stein, 1989. And I think, so he brings up a couple of issues like police brutality being the issue of the knee. He said, what about black abortion rights, fatherless homes? Well, the thing is like the issues are, to me, the issues are the issues. Like if you cannot just ignore one of the issues or two of the issues or three of the issues because it doesn't, you know, fit with what you want. It's like the issues are the issues. Like, and you have to look at all of them, right? In order to have that actual conversation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at everything. You cannot, it's almost, there's a term in psychology where if you, and I can't remember it, but if you're doing an exercise and you're taking the data that supports your argument, but you're disregarding the data that does not, you gotta take all of that stuff in, and you've got to process it through all the stuff. You can't leave stuff out. You know, Never mind. I'm not going there. But go ahead.
But hey,
Next.
I get what because you lose, like you said, you lose credibility, and that's what ends up because I think it shows a bit of cowardice in the argument. If you're not willing to say, look, there are certain issues within the police departments that need to be addressed, and there's also issues that need to be addressed within the Black community. Okay, then let's address those things and have that conversation. Otherwise, I think it's one of those things like you do sort of lose that credibility. It's like, well, this thing is hanging right here. You need to look at that too.
Well, I certainly didn't want to go there, but here we go, right? So
I know. I want to move on to the next question, but I want to leave that to you if you want to address that.
So here it is. Yeah, there is an issue of police brutality. There's an issue of implicit bias. I've seen footage of white suspects charging police officers, beating them up, hitting on them and stuff, and nothing happens. Well, if he was Black, that probably would have been something else. That story would have ended a different way. So I understand that. But then I also understand that there's stuff that's going on in the Black community that there's no excuse for. I just lost one of my 6th grade students over the July 4th weekend. And when I hear something like that, when the thing first came on the news, I'm doing the math. Okay, how old was he? He would have been this. And then I got a text the next morning, said it was him. Well, that hurts, man. And I cannot justify what's going on. It needs to be addressed. A parent would say to his child, you know what? I love you, but I got to tear your behind up over this because this ain't how you've been raised. This is not you. Yeah. And we've got to take responsibility. The other thing I will say for this, the last thing I'm going to say is I'm not interested in people who want to point out the problems all the time and have not once provided a solution or tried to be a part of the solution. Because I've got people I'm connected to on Facebook. They look for every negative Black article they can come up with or any negative political thing they can come up with. Right. But when it comes to something that they're standing for, they won't mention it. Yeah. Ain't got time for that. No. That's a part of the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't have time for it either. Amen to that. All right. I want to move to this question. So going back to the statues, I know there's a rabbit trail. Sometimes I do answer some of the questions, though, that come in. In June, President Trump mentioned a 10-year sentence for toppling statues, and that's sort of citing the Veterans Memorial Preservation Act. And I'll give you just for our viewers some of what is in that act. It allows for fines and a prison term of up to 10 years for attempts to injure or destroy any structure, plaque, statue, or other monument on public property commemorating the service of any person or persons in the armed forces of the United States. What are your thoughts of this 10-year, sort of referencing the Veterans Memorial Preservation Act and this 10-year threat of a prison sentence for destroying federal property and monuments?
Well, let me reiterate again in case somebody just tuned in late. I am against any sort of violence, any sort of tearing down property, because it undermines what you are doing. But now, and I don't want to get too far off talking about the chief executive, all right? And you know why.
Right.
But I will say this. Ultimately, statues, it's just stuff. It's an inanimate object, and you're going to send somebody to jail for potentially 10 years?
Yeah.
Okay. But you mean to tell me I can embezzle millions of dollars and serve a few months in jail? I can commit felony offenses and get commuted? So once again, I say, I'm dealing with young people. I'm trying to build up future leaders. And I'm telling them, you do the right thing, you go to school, you make good grades, and be a good citizen, everything will be all right. But wait a minute. How do I explain to them somebody's going to get 10 years for knocking down a statue, but you can steal millions of dollars of veterans' retirement in some sort of scheme and maybe do 3 years?
I mean, come on. I mean, come on. Like, exactly. I mean, it's like there is a disproportionate. I mean, when I saw like 10 years, I'm like, I am for you make sure that this property, these monuments are protected. And I think that there should be punishment for it. But I think we have gotten so caught up. I mean, I mention this a lot. I do mention this a lot, that we have so many criminal laws on the books. We have no idea how many criminal laws we actually have on the books. They have actually tried several times. And the last person who wanted to try it was Neil Gorsuch. He was going to put a team together to find out how just criminal laws. And they said they tried this in the 90s. In the 90s. For 2 years, and could not figure out how many laws they have on the books. Just criminal. That has nothing to do with civil. And that has nothing to do with, you know, the 2+ million pages added to the Federal Registry since 30 years ago. Since 30 years, we've had 2 million plus. So I mentioned this not too long ago, that we are a nation of laws, but we're also a nation of way too many laws, you know, to where the laws just don't add up. They don't make sense to an extent.
Well, you know, listen, I'm trying not to, but you're making me go back to the Bible again.
Come on now.
They start out with 10 commandments, and then there are a series of other laws. But why do you have to have so many laws? Because the person's heart ain't right.
Amen.
That's what it comes down to. And ultimately, in the New Testament, we found out, hey, there's only 2 things. Love the Lord, the God, with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy strength, and love your neighbor like you love yourself. You know what? It's a heart issue. It is the spirit behind it. It's not just the written law. Of course, you got to legislate stuff so folk will know that you can't just break into somebody's house and expect no consequences.
Right.
But it's a heart issue.
Yes, it is.
And all this stuff that we're talking about, it's a heart issue. Until that changes, you know, we could be running around this thing for the next generation. Yeah. You know, but and I don't see any way around it, because when I look at what people are saying on social media, I'm like, look, if you ain't, everybody got an opinion, but I know for me, when I try to talk, when I have something to say, I hope it is inspired by God, you know, according to what God has revealed to me in my own prayer time, man. And listen, I did not want to go there tonight, but I don't see any other way around it, because we're not going to figure this thing out on our own.
Let me tell you something, because you may not have wanted to go there on it, but look, I'm in 100% agreement with you on it. It is a heart issue. And we can go into more laws of how we have created laws to ensure that people will not have a change of heart, because we've made Christianity and talking about God taboo. So the Bible says you reap what you sow. Like, when you sow this stuff, look what you are going to reap. So it is a heart issue, John. It is a heart issue. And I talked to a pastor on this show a couple of weeks ago, and it's like a lot of what's going on is a spiritual attack. We need prayer more than anything else right now. And we need people to be praying. All right.
And I will even go as far as to say, you know, prior to the American Civil War, the 10, 15 years prior to that Civil War was fought out in the churches. And the church had an opportunity to address the issue and did not. Yeah. And you had to split with the Southern Baptists, you had Methodist splitting, and you have all these splits because some folk are trying to justify slavery, some people are not. And even the ones who didn't necessarily want slavery wasn't necessarily out of the magnanimity of their heart. It was because it was an economics thing. because if you don't have slavery, then you got to pay people. You got more jobs available, but you have to pay people. But I think that we have the opportunity to address this thing. And if we do not, watch this. 150 something years ago, it wasn't addressed, and it ended up pouring out on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the opportunity again. I'm hoping it does not pour out on the battlefield.
Yeah, I hope so too. All right, well, we'll see where we go after this last question. All right.
Okay. Is this the last question? I got 4 pages of notes I was ready to get to.
Hey man, look, we've got 20 minutes, so we'll spend the time.
Okay.
We'll spend the time, my friend.
All right.
What should be done with the Confederate statues?
Oh, geez. Well, yeah, that is a $64,000 question.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's my thing. What I'm about to say is probably not popular, but here is my thing.
Okay.
I would not have a problem with monuments, memorials, or the Confederate flag if they became symbols of what we used to be. Can you imagine somebody looking up at one of those monuments and memorials and say, you know what? We used to be this way in our country, but we finally dealt with that race issue once and for all. And here we are now. This represents, when we see this, it represents who we are now. Case in point, for those who are Christians, right? When you saw the cross, the cross was a sign of execution, death, and defeat. And then after one particular Sunday, it becomes a symbol of commutation, life, and victory. It is the exact same symbol, but the story changed. You see it in the Old Testament. Jacob becoming Israel. He was one person when he was Jacob, but then he had an encounter with God and he became Israel. It was a completely different story. Same person, two different stories. And I think that if that's what these monuments and memorials ended up becoming in our narrative, I'd have no problems with it. The problem is, and I mentioned it before, it is a heart problem, and people do not want to change. And so here's my answer. I think that those memorials and monuments need to come down.
Okay.
Right? At least off of public lands. I can see, like, if you go to Gettysburg, they have a series of statues on the Confederate side, 2 of the most beautiful statues on the South side, North Carolina and Virginia, right? Now, I think in a situation like that, yeah, I wouldn't mind having them there if you're going to tell the story and tell the story correctly, right? But listen, you can't, if you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, you've got to admit that you've got a problem before they can do anything with you. Look, you can't even come to God unless you admit that there is a problem. And if you have a problem with alcohol, and there's nothing inherently wrong with drinking alcohol, but if you have a problem with it, it's probably best for you to take it away, for you to keep it out of your house.
Yeah.
The problem is we've got people who are intoxicated on this lost cause history. That, oh, we're just trying to protect our way of life and our heritage. And well, what was that heritage? Your ancestors claiming ownership over someone else?
Yeah.
Is that what you're trying to protect? I mean, because you cannot separate the Confederacy and symbols of racism. You can't do it.
Yeah.
And so, is that what you're trying? Because people will argue, well, I'm just trying to, really? I find that hard to believe. You don't see Nazis trying to say, hey, listen, I keep this swastika because my grandfather. No, they don't allow that stuff to happen in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you, and here's the other thing that people will say. It says, well, that wasn't me. That was my ancestors who did all that stuff. Y'all just need to get over the slavery issue. Well, you know what? Matthew 23, Jesus is talking to the disciples and he accuses them of something. They say, oh, that wasn't us. That was our ancestors. Yeah. How could he accuse us? Because it was in the DNA. If they had the opportunity There are people today, if they had the opportunity to go back to the way this country was prior to 1865, they would do it. So for that reason, I think they need to come down. However, people are going to say, but you can't erase history. You're not erasing history. Right. You're removing symbols that turned into something else. All of those Confederate memorials and statues, they came up, there are two particular times they came up in our history. In the early 1900s, what just happened? Plessy versus Ferguson had just taken place in 1898. You've got Jim Crow laws that are trying to segregate and keep people from voting. And these statues start coming up. You've got black folk who go and fight for freedom and liberty abroad in World War I to come back home to be lynched in uniform. And it was a way of saying, hey, look, you may have fought for that overseas, but it's not going to happen here. And then it happens again in the 50s and the 60s. You got statues of Robert E. Lee and Jeff and folk coming up in 1948. Yeah. And it's like, okay, so what do you say about that? You know, what's happening there? Modern day civil rights movement. You've got black folk who've gone and fought in World War II. They've fought in Korea. They've come home, and you're saying, hey, you know what? You may have fought for that stuff overseas, but it ain't gonna happen here. One of the things that I found interesting, World War II, Frank Capra and some other guys who were Hollywood producers were commissioned. They became officers to do one thing: make propaganda films, right, to get support, right? There was one in particular he made. It was called The Negro Soldier. You can Google that on YouTube. And it was about, oh my goodness, Carlton Moss was a screenwriter, African-American screenwriter. He actually plays the preacher in that movie. And so he's talking to his congregation, well-dressed, and some of them are veterans in uniform, and he talks about why blacks need to get behind the country, right? Yeah. And he goes through from the Revolutionary War up to World War II. What I found interesting was when they got to the Civil War, our most cataclysmic event in our history, it took about 16 seconds to go through that. Yeah. And they did not mention black folk at all participating. I'm wondering, how can you possibly do that, especially if you're trying to get black folk to come alongside? Now, here's why. Because here's why. You're trying to get the country on one page. Yeah. You do not want to remind certain people that between the years of 1861, 1860, well, actually more specifically, 1863 through 65, black folk put on a uniform to help bring folk back into this union by force. Yeah. And I thought that was Frank Capra's decision, and I didn't find out till later. It was not. He actually got frustrated over this. What it was the War Department told them, you can do this movie, but do not mention the Civil War. Do not don't mention Lincoln. Don't mention abolitionists. Don't mention black folk taking up arms. Hmm. So you know, these symbols have been symbols of intimidation. Yeah. And I'm gonna tell you, my goodness, one of my Facebook acquaintances, he says black folk are the most racist folk around nowadays. And I'm thinking, if you're talking about the past 5 or 6 days, you may have an argument. But if you look at our country, the history of our country in totality, some of the stuff that has happened to black folk, towns where they had thriving businesses were burned down, veterans coming home in uniform being lynched in uniform. Mm-hmm. And it's people trying to vote, going to the house, blowing up the house, or pulling them out, and you don't see them again. You know, and listen, if someone out there can explain to me how you can separate these Confederate memorials and monuments and this overt expressions of racism, I'd like to hear it. I would like to hear that argument as well. Let me see. I mean, you know what? I had some examples of okay. So we talked about numerous examples of intimidation. Dylan Root, right, who went into an African-American AME church, killed 9 parishioners who were there praying with him and for him before he did it. Mm-hmm. He's got pictures with the Confederate flag. Protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, Confederate flags. Just this past week, there was racist vandalism in the high school. They had put something racist on the field. Thank God the kids said we're not having no hate here, and they ended up putting in T-shirts out there, no hate here, right? But they showed the pictures of these kids. I don't have to tell you what they look like,
Yeah.
right? And then, of course, Alexander Stevens, when people say, oh, it's just a way of life, he was clear on what the Confederacy was all about. In his cornerstone speech, he says that slavery was going to be the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And there were about 3 or 4 other states in their state constitutions also said this thing was about slavery. Mm-hmm. And I find it interesting because I had a friend say, well, you know what? He didn't really mean that. Somebody just thrusted the speech in his hand in the last few moments, and he just ended up reading. He didn't even know what he was reading.
Yeah.
Please.
Let me touch on that one point, and I want to give you my view on the Confederate statues. But I am so sick and tired of people telling me, or just saying it out there, like this person didn't mean that, and whether that person's even alive anymore or not, they continue like, well, that's not what he meant. Like, don't tell me what the person didn't mean when, or meant otherwise when the person said it. That drives me nuts more than just about anything, because now you're saying, I looked into that person's heart and I know exactly what that person meant when they said, and it's the opposite of what they said. That is so irritating to me, and it to no end.
Yes.
So we talked about the statues situation a couple of weeks ago on the show, Alan and myself. And I made mention of the Confederate statues, and I said, I think the Confederate statues need to come down. And I said, and here is my correlation. I said, how many statues? I said, because one, we have these Confederate statues in public land, and there is no context to those statues. They're just up, right? And so I agree with what you're saying. It's like if you have a battlefield and you've got, okay, put the statues out there and give context to, this was Robert E. Lee, this was Ulysses S. Grant, and these are the two sides. Okay, that's fine. But I said, how many statues do we have up of Benedict Arnold? A traitor to the country. The quote-unquote #1 traitor to the country. Well, last time I checked, Benedict Arnold didn't start a war within a war, right? And so for me, as well, it's, you have these Confederate statues that are up that represent wanting to tear the country apart and start another country. These are statues commemorating treason. And so from that perspective, I find it really, look, people say, well, Robert E. Lee was a good man. He only wanted to do it because he didn't want to fight his fellow Virginians. Okay, whatever. I don't care where you come from with that. It does not change the fact that he committed treason against his country, split the country apart, resulting in more than 600,000 men being killed. And to say that, okay, we can keep those statues up as a commemoration and say that, and let people who don't know maybe about the Civil War, because God knows, these kids aren't getting taught good history in class. It's the subject that suffers the most of all subjects in school is U.S. history. So they're going to look at this guy has a statue to him and correlate that with this is a good person. And it's like, no, the opposite is true. This person committed high treason and fought against the country that you live in right now. So I can't make the correlation of this is justified to have them up in public lands. If you want to have statues in museums about the Civil War, fantastic, perfect, go ahead and do it. But don't play the game and put these statues up as if these are good. They were good Americans. They weren't. So.
Yeah, you're right. And let me tell you, remember, This civil war ends in April of 1865. By the fall of 1865, when Congress comes back in, six former Confederate generals, six former Confederate colonels, and some ex-Confederate cabinet members take seats in the United States Congress. Now, how do you explain that? These are guys, listen, you should have died for treason. And they end up right back in the driver's seat making key decisions on the nation that they tried to destroy?
Yeah.
How do we explain that?
I don't know. I mean, I know that Abraham Lincoln was like, let's move forward. You know, we will forgive. We will blah, blah, blah. And he sort of references that in his, you know, second inaugural. But it's like, yeah, forgive, but don't forget. And then, and it goes, you hear people, and we only got a couple of minutes left, John, but you hear, you know, ministers will say this a lot, but you also hear people say this is like, if somebody hurts you and continues to hurt you, okay, forgive them. Christ said 70 times 7. You just forgive.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let that person set up home in your life. Much like you wouldn't, that was a mistake. Like you don't let the ones who committed treason set up home in Congress.
That's right.
So there were mistakes that were devastating prior to the Civil War, post-Civil War. To an extent, I mean, we still suffer from those today.
Absolutely.
John, our hour is about up. Man, thank you so much for coming on the show. Golly, what a fantastic conversation.
Oh,
Always
thanks, man. Thanks for
conversation. So very thankful for you to be on. Thank you again. Tell people about your website one more time and what you do.
So my website is John W. McCaskill History Live. The website, if you just Google that, you'll find it was JWM History Live. I have a YouTube channel where I'm doing films on history. I have my Facebook page, John W. McCaskill History Live. Also, John W. McCaskill on Instagram, and I can be found through any of those venues. And the purpose of what I'm doing is, listen, I tell people, if I got a phone call at 2:45 in the morning and you ask me what my purpose is, I'm going to say teaching the principles of leadership and teamwork using history as a vehicle through which to do it. Now, I may not remember the rest of the conversation, but I am clear on that piece right there.
I know
and
you
so
are.
That's what I'm trying to do. Listen, what's important to me is training up the next generation that has character, that are competent, and has a camaraderie about themselves where they're trying to inspire those who are around them. Because let me tell you something. Whether you have a good roster or a bad roster, there is a common denominator if your team is going to be great. And it is this: you must find better players. Amen. And I had a coach once say, you cannot make chicken salad out of chicken mess. You got to go get the real thing. And we're trying to get the real thing with this next generation of kids.
Amen. John, thank you again so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your comments, your questions, being a part of this conversation. Thanks, KB Wright or K Bright 71. Thank you very much for, it was an awesome chat. I have to agree with him. John,
Thanks,
thank you again. And I know that not too far down the road, I'm going to have you on the show again. So
hey, just call me, man. I'm there.
You got it. All the best to you. Thank you very much.
Dustin.
And I'll talk to you later.
Appreciate you, man.
You got it.
We'll see you.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I got about 10 seconds left. You can go check out our podcast. We put it out every week, just about everywhere you can hear. See you later. Now, that was a really good conversation, even if I have to say so myself. Now, if you could do us a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you don't mind, like and comment on this video. While you're doing that, I'm going to wait for Thomas Jefferson to make his next move. You always win that staring contest. It's your move! Go! Okay. You seeing this? Are you watching this?